Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second GRC Community Experts discussion. So today, joining us from the UK and the US, we have some of our most active and knowledgeable GRC community experts. We're going to have Eric Lemartre, Rafael Cardozo, Philip Swan, my colleague Jagan Rao, and possibly others will join us later during the call. So we know that new GRC users have a lot to learn to make the best of the GRC product for their own particular use cases. You also all know that we recommend to select and hire an implementation partner, to not go alone. We also recommend to take some very specific and very well built trainings. We recommend to view the free tutorials that are available in the community, but there are always questions that linger. People need clarifications to feel really comfortable with the various features of the product. And the community is a great tool to get answers to these questions. Of course, the ServiceNow support teams are here to help. But today, we're going to take a look at some of those questions from a real user who says what you see on the screen, right? After playing with GRC for a couple of weeks and going through the various training materials, I still have questions. And of course, we want to provide answers. So I've prepared a list of those questions that I've shared with our guests today in advance. So is it normal or acceptable to not have controls assigned to every entity in an entity type? I was under the impression that control objectives had to be assigned for each entity within an entity type.
I can maybe give a 2-minute response to that. When you manage your entity types, you will assign policies and all control objectives to your entity type, and it will generate towards all the entities corresponding to your filter. From an entity owner standpoint, you will receive a standard set of controls because of you belonging to this entity type A, and entity type B, and entity type C. And of course, we deduplicate, so you will receive only one of those if the same control objective is present in different entity types. But what do I do with these control objectives that I received as an owner of an entity itself? Out of the box, you can actually remove controls. So, except if you put a specific rule, a specific script to prohibit that, entity owners could remove some of the controls which have been generated automatically by the entity engine, and by the way, remove all of them if they really want to be extreme. So, it is possible to have entities without any control, even if they belong to an entity type, because they may have manually deleted them. But the logic normally is if you push control objectives towards different entities belonging to an entity type is for a reason. It's because they are of the same nature. They're all in EMEA or they're all in the US, hence they need to comply to this particular regulation, hence this control, etc. Or if it's a system or an application, because all of them are PCI DSS related, for instance, hence they need to have this credit card control implemented, etc. So that the top-down structure of the system of entities in ServiceNow. But yes, at the borderline, you can imagine an entity owner removing all the controls manually that he has inherited.
Is it not true that control owners can also request exceptions?
They can request exceptions, but that doesn't remove the control.
Okay,
the control is still there. It is in exception for a while, typically for a few months, etc. But it is not removed. The control still applies. It's just temporarily put in exception.
Okay, and who controls the stage of the control? Could a control owner just say, "Oh, I'm just going to put this one in retire stage and therefore not be held accountable to it"?
It's possible. If you are the control owner, you absolutely can put it into retire stage. But it is the role of the librarian and the people who manage the what I generally call the risk universe, or all this package of entities which are generated for different parts of the organizations. Each time they will regenerate new controls, even if you have put it into retired, it will come back to draft.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay, got it.
So you can hide it into retire for a while, but as soon as somebody will re-update it, it will come back to draft.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. Let's look at the next question. Same thing, looking for what is normal, right? And we talked a little bit about this last time we met, and I was pushing, I think it was Scott, to give us some sort of a number of what is acceptable for entity types. So what do we have here? Is it normal, acceptable to have a lot of entity types? But more specifically, it seems that entity types would need to be very specific in order for the control objective to be appropriate for all the entities in an entity type. We'll go back to the same advice, which is start simple and small. Start high level, simple and small, right? Eric, do you have anything to add?
Well, it's clearly learn to walk before you run, that's for sure. And it's really a link to the maturity of the customer as well, and the size of the customer. That's why there's no one answer fits all here. I'm working for one of the largest banks in Europe, and we talk about 52 entity types just for IT, 250,000 people. Very, very mature organization. Today they do that with a spreadsheet, which they've taken 5 years to develop with so many calculations in everywhere to assign a system of control of 10,000 controls to the IT organization. So you can imagine the size of the problem. If you are starting, yes, start small, start probably with what you have out of the box, etc., and learn and see the impact of what you do before to try to create too much. But very large organization, very mature one, will go for a much more complex structure of entity types, that's for sure.
Okay, let's move on to the next one, which has to do with SOX and the SOX content pack. It looks like this customer is experiencing something unexpected, which doesn't look like any authority documents / citations were loaded with the SOX content pack.
It is true. There's no authority documents in the SOX pack. We have actually a lot of the customers which are just using the internal view of the thing, meaning they manage their internal policy of financial controls and they link their control objectives to their policy. That's it.
Policy, yeah.
And that can work without any authority documents and citation at all. It's absolutely fine. Now, if you want to comply and be able to justify a level of compliance to external regulatory requirements, then yes, you need to use the authority documents and citations. Not all companies are interested with that. So yes, you can use control objectives which are not related to citations, but they need to be related to policies. There's no error in there because it works perfectly. No worries with that.
Let's move on to the next one about filters. And Raphael, I think I'm going to get back to you on this one, right? Is there any training about entity filters?
I think we return back to what is an entity. Before we start by entity filters, what is an entity? Entity, well, we can find a lot of videos on YouTube or the community. Entity can be defined as those people, those places, objects, things that we need to manage risk with, things that we are going to apply controls to. I'm going to find here entity and entity types. I never created entities manually. I all the time use entity filters to create my own entities because I don't need to be careful in a way that if they are no longer meaningful for that entity type, it gets inactivate or retired by default, and all the controls risk.
Anybody else wants to add to this?
Yeah, this is Jagan.
Jagan? Yeah, Jagan.
Yeah, this is a way to drop down or narrow down the choices from a large table, right? For example, if you have large set of servers, you want to create a filter or only some servers. This is a way to start. And also, this also helps you to guide and go through the filtering criteria rather than thinking around. This will show the fields from that table which can be filterable. It can be country, if it's a location type, if it's server type, maybe if it's a PII data, or depending on what other attributes are there. That's why
So essentially, it allows you to create entities without having them live in a vacuum. They're immediately linked to something. So would you advise that this is really the best way to create entities and that this should be used at the time of the entity scoping?
Correct. If you are creating from the existing source, yes, this is the best way to create entity types because there are other CMDB tables or other tables from ServiceNow that is being used.
That's very powerful.
Okay. One thing I may want to add here, if you can come back to an entity type, Raphael, is actually you can have more than one entity filter. And it's very useful if you want to create a typology, for instance, for all your PCI DSS assets or things. You can put a filter on the table on servers, but as well on a table on applications, a table on databases, a table on etc. And they will all create entities into one particular entity type, even if they come from different tables. And you will apply the same controls, the same risks, etc. to all of those.
That's really powerful. What you're saying, Eric, is I can combine multiple tables and create one type.
Exactly.
That's really
by having multiple entity filters.
Let's move to the next question. So are entity classes only additional reporting filtering aid, or do they play other roles?
So I don't know if you are all aware, but there is a great module called GRC Workbench that I encourage you to discover if you have not done it yet. And when you click on that, it opens this this kind of page. It represents basically the structure of an example of structure of entity classes. So the entity classes are used mainly in two purpose. The first purpose, which is to report, because you can associate any kind of entity to a class, and then you can of course report for different classes, etc. You can filter with classes, including in your dashboard with interactive filters, etc. So it's very, very useful for that. But the other way, which is for me much more important with classes, is to build this structure, and that represents your aggregation journey through ServiceNow GRC. Let's start at the bottom. I have information assets here. If I have risk, if I have controls which are compliant, non-compliant, risk very high or very, very low, etc., it will, of course, roll up to the database that hosts this data. But the database that hosts this data will roll up to a server that will roll up to a business service, which is managed by business units and maybe to a company. So without this structure, basically your risks are stuck with a particular entity, but it will not impact the rest of the organization. So you can really create easily this kind of structure. Say, for instance, I have business unit, but I have as well departments. So I want to add departments in here. I will just drag behind company that I have as well departments. It's fine. And I've created this connection. I will be able to connect department risks to company ones, or control into departments to controls into a company. If I try to use an example built behind this, let's go for my financial system, for instance. And my financial system here clearly has two servers here, but as well is linked to SAP Enterprise Services. Right? So I can see the connection. If I have risks in here, they will escalate to this business service, which is the child of another business service at the top here. And you can really manage. I want to add here a vendor, for instance, SAP, for instance. So I can connect another dimension and say, actually, this vendor, which is as well an entity belonging to the class vendor, impacts my system, and if this vendor fail, of course, I will have problem with my financial system, right? And it will impact this system that will maybe impact a department, a business unit, a company, etc. at the top. All of this is possible because you have built your dependency model first to represent what kind talk to what. You will see that as well in the record itself. If I go in here to my entities, I will come to my same financial system. So the entity has been created from my CMDB business service record. And I can see here that I have my upstream entities, the exact same two that I had before. Well, my enterprise services, I didn't see the other one because it was one level above in my graphics. So it was not represented, but it's there. It impacts the finance department. And I have three downstream entities, my two servers and my vendor, which are here with different classes. And all the risks from these people will impact me. So I can see them here actually. I can see here that I have risks on me, but I have as well risks from my vendor impacting me. I have risk from my servers impacting me, etc. Right? All of this is possible because of the connection you have created in the GRC Workbench, or directly here by adding or removing some relationships. So my recommendation here is really take that seriously. Don't keep your controls and your risks just locked down into a specific entity, but make them impacting roll up through the organization by leveraging the GRC Workbench and the capability to link entity classes together. And for each entities of each classes, then you can rebuild these relationships together. So for me, it's a great value of the entity class.
Yeah, you can link them together, and that gives you an overall understanding of what's going on.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
back to the top of the organization if needed.
Yeah, all the way to the top, yeah. The entity type is a very functional, structural way to do things, as the entity class is really a business way to look at things.
Clearly.
That makes sense. All right, let's move on to the next one. There's quite a bit of text here. So we've built out our risk frameworks in our ServiceNow environment. And then we built out the relationships for one of the risk statements by creating an entity type, entities, or authorities, etc., etc. Have you seen any other companies start with a risk framework in determining their use cases? And what pitfalls do you see with this approach?
Yes. So I'm working with another bank, and we are building their operational risk capabilities, leveraging the advanced risk module. So it's not IT, it's purely business. Clearly, when you talk about second line of defense, corporate compliance team and a chief risk officer team are totally different. It's not the same world, it's different kind of teams, etc. In these kind of large organizations. You generally have different level of maturity as well. Sometimes one is more mature than another, more willing to move to workflows, etc. with ServiceNow. And this particular case is the risk organization, which is the engine to make a move. So for about 1 year, 1 year and a half now, they have started with the risk events. And then when I joined them in February, we have started to put together a risk library together with 4 levels of hierarchy, covering all the business. But the corporate compliance team has decided to wait and see. So they will probably be in the 2021 phase of implementation. So what I want to illustrate here is every customer is different, and you will have promoters. You have people who wants to make a move, and it's not abnormal to start from the risk perspective. We know that very classic GRC capabilities, particularly in the past 10 to 15 years, etc., were very much compliance driven. But more and more, you see organizations which are really risk-driven, and where the promoters, the actual sponsors for making a move and a project, are actually into risk. It's not a big challenge to start with risk only. As far as you build your risk universe, as far as you build your entity types, entity classes, to define where this library of risk should apply and how it should apply for different typologies, etc., it still works. And clearly, now that we have some success, something to show to the corporate compliance people, they have decided to join the project in 2021. So my response is yes, it's absolutely valid to start with risk only. The critical thing is try to build your risk universe with your entity classes and entity types in a way that you keep the future open, so that it's not too specific just for risk, but you build the structure of business units, companies, vendors, systems, people, projects, etc. All the key objects you want to have into your risk universe, so that you can apply your risks and tomorrow have something that makes sense as well, if possible, for the compliance people.
So thinking of the future, making sure
Correct.
that you future-proof your...
Absolutely, yeah.
We have a question from Samir.
Yeah, this is to Eric. Eric, I mean, you mentioned about onboarding some of the promoters like risk guys. I mean, they want to start ahead of, let's say, compliance, and I agree. I mean, you need some kind of early adopters, right? But there is another challenge that each of these teams could have a different definition of what entities would mean, right? I mean, risk team may have a different definition of entity, and they want to drive entity types based upon their definition, and then whoever is coming on late adopters, they would have a different opinion about entity types and entity definitions.
Yeah.
How do you bridge that? Go ahead.
I fully agree. It's the key challenge, as I said. It's not managing the risk library, etc. It's managing the risk universe. It's putting together your entity types and classes in a way that is not just for risk, just for one use case, but for something that can grow and cover tomorrow other use cases as well. That's the challenge. And I generally use this with my customers as a challenge to get them early into the project, to say, well, Mr. X, Y, Z, you are in this particular use case. You said you want to join in 2021. Okay, you're cool. But be aware that we are building now things. And if you don't want to be part of it now, at least for that part of definition of the classes and types of entities, you may not have your say tomorrow, because what we will have said, we'll try to be as open as possible, as flexible as possible, to not insult the future, right? But if you want to make your point, it's the right moment. So my recommendation is, don't come in 2021, come now around the table and talk to us. And it's generally a very nice way to bring people together.
Is there a way, Eric, to help make an objective choice when there's clearly people with different opinions? And maybe who is the referee, if it's possible to have one, and what is the tool that can help make an objective choice?
The difficulty in that discussion is very often, because they have different opinions, because they come from different background in the organization, they take you, the GRC architect, as the referee. It's not a good position to be in, because at the end of the day, you will be in charge and accused if something goes wrong, right? And because you will always have to make choices that will please someone and not please the others, you will always make enemies then. So it's a kind of position I would recommend to try to avoid, to be the referee. Typically, if it's possible, I would recommend to grow in the food chain in the organization. I had very often used that as an opportunity to go to the COO, for instance, and say, well, we need to put these guys around the table and get an agreement. So by the way, you are the operational director. Can you please decide something? And then you get visibility as well to the enterprise, not just the risk team, not just the compliance team, not just the audit team, but you get a visibility from everyone by doing so. It's generally a nice move, not always possible, but I try this when really you hurt a blockage that you have too many stakeholders with different opinions and you cannot move forward.
This is Jagan. We need to also do the readiness assessment, right? Who are the champions? Who are going to be there? What is the impact? Getting a awareness and readiness assessment is also very important.
It's a very good point, Jagan. And for the audience, Jagan put together a great tutorial and a downloadable checklist that we call the readiness assessment. So I recommend you all to go to the community, find this tutorial. All right, we're coming now to the last question. So during this process that we just talked about, something unexpected happened, which was top of the authority document screen, there was something showing as invalid policy or risk framework. It's now disappeared. Do you think this is something that is common that they should be worried about, or is it just a temporary glitch? Rafael, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can take this one. That was an issue, was the initial patches of Newark, which has been fixed. Okay, if you take a look here on the communities, on the first releases of Newark, there was an issue, the message. So every time you open an authority document, it was throwing you an issue called invalid policy framework. Okay. So this one has been fixed on the last versions, and from that moment on, everything is working fine.
Thank you very much for that. So it's a temporary glitch, and hopefully it's been fixed with the new versions of the application. Yeah. We are coming to the end of our hour, but also to the end of the questions. So thank you very much all for participating, for attending, but also, of course, to our guests for sharing your expertise, your wisdom. Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you very much, Jagan, and everybody else.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Eric.
Bye-bye.